One. Welcome back to Voices of the Regenerative Decade. I'm Becca Dakini, your host, and you're here at One Earth Live. I'd like to welcome our next guest, Michael Meade. Michael Meade is a renowned storyteller, author, and scholar of mythology, anthropology, and psychology. He combines hypnotic storytelling, street-savvy perceptiveness, and spellbinding interpretations of ancient myths with a deep knowledge of cross-cultural rituals. Michael is founder and director of Mosaic Multicultural Foundation, a non-profit network of artists, activists, and community builders that encourages greater understanding between diverse peoples. And I must say, he's a phenomenal storyteller. So, Michael, it's wonderful to have you with us today for Voices of the Regenerative Decade. Thanks for joining us.
Really good to be with you, Becca.
Thank you. Michael, I'd love you to introduce yourself and maybe start to talk about how your work could be useful to those focused on planetary solutions and regeneration.
So, like you said, I'm a storyteller, but also a mythologist in the sense that I study story and myth, which many people think is in the past behind us, but really I call it living mythology. Mythology was not left behind. It lives inside people and it lives inside the world. And from a mythological point of view, there are always two stories going on. The stories of the living world, which has two sides, the nature and culture, and they each used to be called a garment, so that nature used to be referred to in certain places as the living green garment of the world. And then culture is supposed to be the multicolored garment that matches and connects to nature. And so modern people wound up thinking that humans are separate from nature, but human nature is part of nature, and therefore we are as well. And so in terms of regenerative work, one of the key things, I think, is reconnecting culture to nature and beginning to imagine a world where the two interact in creative ways. Another idea comes to mind very quickly. People think creation is in the past, and we're in the echo of some creation that happened as a big bang or whatever the story might be a long time ago. But in mythology, the understanding is creation is ongoing, and humans, because of this strange spirit soul arrangement we have inside of us, are actually potential agents of ongoing creation. But in order to be proper agents, we have to be awakened to our own nature, the workings of our own, I call it the soul. They say in the old stories, the individual soul is connected to the soul of the world. So when the earth is in pain, the soul of the human mourns and would, hope to help with that. So to me, stories are the kind of essence of relationship. People in a relationship each go out and do something. They come back home, they tell each other the story. Here's what happened. We relate through stories. And so mythology has stories about the relationship between humanity and nature. And I think those become increasingly important. And so I feel like my job, well, first of all, I'm guided by stories, and then stories come to me at certain times, and then I'm required to tell them. And more lately, the stories that come in are about creation and recreation. So I've created a genre called recreation stories, myths about how the world renews from its own ashes, from its own pain, and from its deep regenerative capacity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. It's great to be speaking to you today. I feel like a lot of the time there is a focus within the regenerative and solutions movements on the outer work. And I really do feel that, it's part and parcel that the inner regenerative landscape is something that needs to be looked at, or how we find ourselves in a space where we start to have the awareness and consciousness about being responsible earth stewards or humans. And I'm wondering what your reflections are on our current state as a species in relationship to the earth, and how we can better move towards finding right relationship with our planet.
So I get asked a lot these days, about whether nature might be finished with the experiment of humanity, that whether humanity or humans might be one of the species that just doesn't have a role anymore. And in mythology, that couldn't happen. In mythology, first of all, the world can't come to an end. Every ending is a beginning. The word end itself doesn't mean good night, finito, over and out. And the meaning of the word end is remnant or loose end. So in what seems like the end, there are remnants of creation that start over again. And so then that connects to the old idea that each person is being pulled into life once they become aware of it by a thread. That humans are, if you go to say like West Africa, you have stories about how each human has a feeling thread that's tied to the stars. And the stars are the things that are pulling us into awakening and into fulfillment, because the word like destiny is a star word, destinare, of the stars. Humans are not isolated accidents in an accidental universe. We're actually coherent beings threaded into the universe when we are awake. And so you and I have talked a little bit about rites of passage or initiation process. That used to be the process through which the individual person could awaken to who they are, why they're here, and what they have to contribute to life. And so the theory I'm working with is, first of all, each person is unique. That's the idea. Um, People can have similar talents, but a person is a unique combination of gifts and capacities and style. And so no one will ever be seen who's exactly like us. That's the setup. Nature doesn't have any copies. Nature only makes originals. Two trees next to each other in the forest are different, and the ravens know that. And so the uniqueness that's in nature flows through humans. And so my sense right now is there are so many problems and now crises in the world. Biggest crisis is the so-called climate crisis. And right while we're in the midst of that comes the coronavirus pandemic, as if a parallel, one inside the human body and one inside the whole planet. It tells us something about what's trying to happen and how much illness in the body of the earth has now manifested as illness in the body of people. There's things to be learned from that. But at the same time, we have a crisis of truth and meaning, which is really serious, because if we can't solve that, we'll be limited in using our own living truth to do healing for ourselves, for other people, and for the earth. So we're in this really remarkable moment in the history of the world where the crises are going all the way from nature, all the way through culture, and the levels and complications of the troubles are so great, there can't be one answer, there can't be one solution. I think it has to be the awakening of many people at the level of the deep soul, so that more and more people begin to realize, I'm here on earth to do this, and I'm going to dedicate my life to doing it. And then what happens, and there are myths about this, is each person just awakens fully, and by awakening and finding their own gifts and their purposeful way of being in the world, they begin to do some healing. And when enough people do that, then you get regeneration on the level of both nature and culture. That's how I'm seeing it.
Well, I'm glad you're seeing it that way, Michael. and I would love to dive a little bit further into that topic with you around rites of passage. And for our viewers that don't know about what rites of passage are, maybe to give some background on what are rites of passage for humanity, and where do you think we find ourselves at this time during this crisis, if we are experiencing a rite of passage?
So rite of passage is one of the terms for radical transformation of life. The other most common term is initiation. And so initiation as a word means to begin, to step into. And so life is supposed to be a series of stepping into places of the unknown in order to awaken more deeply and experience a transformation of one's life. And so the general idea is traditional cultures to one level or another would have rites of passage for girls and boys or whoever, because you don't go from childhood to so-called adulthood by a kind of a simple process. You have a developmental process for childhood and children, which is much better understood now, I think, psychologically. But the development from child to the full-blown grown person is a leap, not a developmental process. And that's where all of cultural life has to be redetermined. Children can be convinced of many things. As soon as you get to the youth and the young people, they can stand on their own a bit and they can push back. And so something else has to be done with them. And the healthiest thing anyone ever found, I think, was rites of passage. Two aspects inside the rites of passage. One, the young person awakens to who they already are inside, how they are shaped from the depth of their own soul. And secondly, some healing is done, because in human life, everyone gets wounded, usually early in life. And so some healing has to happen if I'm to blossom into a fuller version of myself. And then that begins to set up the road of one initiation after the other. That is to say, each stepping in to the next situation requires awakening to deeper capacities of the self or soul, and each step requires healing. So then you have something called, or at least I call it, collective rite of passage. And I saw it back in the 60s when I was part of it, and I've been waiting for it to happen again, and I have seen nothing that has qualified for it except for climate crisis, because it affects everyone, because it affects nature and human nature. It's the opportunity for a collective rite of passage, which would mean those two things. More and more people awaken to what's already inside human nature and inside nature itself. The connection between the two gets deeper and gets more imaginative and more inspired. And then also healing occurs to the humans and to the earth. So that would be like a collective rite of passage. And I think it's already started, because the first step of a rite of passage is separation. And what I try to say to people is the world that we used to have is gone already. It's already gone. The arguments about going back to normal in the midst of coronavirus is a fool's argument, or a fool's kind of journey, because the world we're going to has already changed. And we're really, really trying to awaken to a world that's trying to come to us. And because of all the trouble in the world, all the illness that's in nature as well as in culture, it has to be that what's trying to come to us is more wholeness. The word healing means make whole. So something whole, I think, is trying to come to us. And you and I have talked about the liminal space. So the second step of a rite of passage would be called the ordeal. You could call it the challenge, the suffering, but it's also called the liminal space, or the liminal area. So what happens, liminal means betwixt and between. Not where we started, not where we hoping to wind up. It's in between. And so in the liminal space is where the change actually occurs. You don't see, even if you're a psychologist, you don't see the change in a person. It happens deep inside. And so deep inside is this liminal capacity that's the root of transformation. And so it involves facing the unknown. And then, because I like to use words as stories, the word liminal is a reference to the base or the bottom part of a threshold or doorway, so that we step into a threshold, leaving the world we came from behind, about to step into a world that's unknown to us. And that's where I think we are in culture now. We're betwixt one thing and the other. And sometimes that manifests as strong opposition, and often it manifests as the fear of the unknown. And then since I like words, there's the word subliminal, which tells me often what we're looking for is coming from below us. We stand in the threshold and we have to allow it to come up. In psychology, it would be coming up from the unconscious. In terms of the earth, it would be coming up from the earth. And so when you deal with mythology, you find out that the earth tries to inform people. It actually tries to heal people. And so we have this opportunity to collect and to connect in a much deeper way to the earth, and the earth can talk to us. I mean, that's the old understanding. Oh, wow. I have been buried in the earth in traditional initiatory ways, and I heard the earth speak to me. Can't explain that right now, but something to think about. So I think the earth is trying to talk to us. I think the unconscious is trying to talk to us, and the imagination in the deep soul of each person is trying to talk to us. And once we gather enough of that knowledge that's ascending from below us into us, then we have a vision to go forward with. So when people are in a hurry to get to the next world, they often miss the radical transformation that happens in the liminal space. The third step is returning to the world as it's usually seen, returning especially to a community of people who can recognize that we've gone through radical alteration and transformation. And since each person is connected to all people, whatever happens to us has to also be connected to people. And so then the community has the role of welcoming people back and confirming the healing that has happened, the visions that have occurred, and the awakenings that have happened. And then you have the individual connected to the community. The individual becomes the inspiration for the community, and the community becomes the support for the individual inspiration, and that would be a proper rite of passage. I think we're in a collective one right now, where we have the opportunity, if not the requirement, to get a new worldview. The old worldview is what's gotten us into this trouble. The idea of humans dominating, the idea of exploiting the earth. It's done a tremendous amount of damage. It's not even a proper worldview. So I think the collective rite of passage is waking to greater, more interconnected, more inclusive worldview that includes nature with culture, culture with nature. But there's one caveat. We can go through a collective change, but it doesn't mean we begin to think together. The source of the collective, the energy of the collective change, the radical capacity for transformation on a collective level has to come from the individual soul. No change at the level of the soul, no change at the level of the world. That's the old understanding. So it's collective, but it involves the awakening of individual genius and other capacities, visionary capacities, and healing capacities in individual souls. At least that's how I'm looking at it. And so that's the archetypal groundwork of transformation, is initiation or rites of passage.
Fabulous. Thank you, Michael, for explaining that to us. Interestingly enough, one of my questions for you is, if the earth could speak, what would she say to us?
So I happen to mention that.
Mm-hmm.
You never know why. It came into my mind. And we were working, a group of us were working with West African rites of passage, initiation rituals. Rituals are a big part of how things work. Animals have their rituals, humans do too, and there are rituals of transformation. So one of the initiation practices is to be buried in the earth at like a 45-degree angle up to your neck with enough weight that you can't move at all. And so what happens is we're used to moving around on the earth, but actually the earth is moving at an extremely fast rate through the cosmos. And once you're solidly in the earth, you realize the thing is flying. And so the first experience is speed. You're connected to the earth and its flow through the cosmos. It's quite psychedelic, actually, and altering. And then if you stay in there long enough, and I have to put a caveat in here, it works better in tropical climates where the earth is several degrees warmer. In temperate climates, actually the earth is pretty cold, and you could wind up getting a little sick. But anyway, the point I'm after here is after I was in there for a while, and you're all on your own. Usually someone sits nearby in case there's trouble, but they are required to be completely silent. So now I'm in there like this at an angle, which is like you're riding the spaceship Earth through the cosmos, and you can feel it. And then someone's talking to me. And I look over at the person who's not supposed to talk, and they're not even paying attention. They are not talking to me. Someone's talking to me, and I realize the Earth is answering the questions I had inside me. During that period, I had a real question about what I should be doing in terms of a tension that I have between the oral tradition and the literary tradition. And the Earth just spoke to me directly as me and said, oral is first, written is second. That helped me. This is the tension I was in. So my experience is the Earth can connect to the intentionality or the destiny questions of our lives. And so I will never forget that experience in terms of feeling deeply connected to the Earth. I'll say one other thing about it. At the time, Mosaic, we were doing a lot of work with severely at-risk young people who were either homeless kids or gang kids, caught up in drugs, caught up in the life as they call it. And they would come to events on drugs. And we found out you could put them in the Earth and the Earth would drain the drugs out of them. That's not hard to understand because we put, what do we put? We put refuse into the Earth and it grows flowers. The Earth is the big transformer of energy. And so I think when you get more connected to the Earth, we get more connected to the vital healing power of Earth, which is, when it's able to operate normally, will really surprise scientists about the Earth's capacity to renew and regenerate even after we mistreat it tragically.
Thank you, Michael. Well, some would say that they find themselves, I guess, within the regenerative movement or focused on how to regenerate our Earth after coming to terms with the degradation and the crisis that we're currently in. It's kind of like a next phase or stage after being in grief and fear and paralysis. So a lot of people, I think, are starting to look at what are the solutions and how do we protect our ecosystems and protect our Earth and regenerate those areas that have been degraded, and maybe even take, the leadership of Indigenous peoples to actually finding right relationship again with the Earth and the web of life. So, this is what I'm watching sprouting within the regenerative movement, almost an inner landscape of self-understanding, of responsibility, of needing to clean up the mess we've made, but then to step into our place in the web of life, which is to learn to be stewards once again of this beautiful biosphere. So on that note, I'm wondering, we're coming to the end of our time together, and do you have any final wisdom on how we can best find our place living in harmony with our Earth?
Well, I'm going to stick with the theme of liminality. So I've collected stories from different cultures around the world, what I call recreation stories. And one of them has the first people winding up in a place where they could feel a connection to the Earth in a good way, but members of the first people got sick. No one even knew what sickness was. And so therefore no one knew healing at all. And so as those people were getting sick and no one even understood what was going on, they left them alone and they were actually getting more sick every day. And until 4 people on some kind of intuition went out and stood in the dark, each of them facing in a different direction. And when they did that, in the stories, it says the one who made the earth spoke to them and said, on this earth, for every illness, there is a cure. For every sickness, there's a remedy. For every wound, there's an antidote. For every trouble, there's an antidote. And so at that point, knowledge came into the world at the same time as healing came into the world. Knowledge and healing are connected. And those were the first people that became the first healers and the first teachers. And then they went out every night and looked into the darkness. And to me, this was the move of liminality. Stand literally in the dark, waiting for the message to come, whether it's coming from the stars or from the earth or the depth of one's own heart or soul. That's not explained in stories. I don't think it should be. The message comes. So what they eventually go back and heal the ones who are sick, by the way. So it's also really a rite of passage story. But what I take from that story is one aspect of the process of getting the vision of where we go next has to be suffering the liminality, which means standing in the dark and saying, I don't know. I have my hopes, I have my own internal kind of aim of life, but there's also so much I don't know. And I think this is a deeply indigenous place to be, open to the inspiration, whether it's coming up from the earth or down from the stars or some stirring in the human heart or soul. I think, so I'll end by saying this. It's not just that we're trying to go to the future. In terms of mythology, the future world's trying to find us. And sometimes all we have to do is stand as vulnerably as possible in the place of unknowing, and something that no one knew arrives, as apparently happened with the first people.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michael. Well, it's come to the end of our time. I'm wondering if you have any final words for our viewers, and if you would like to share any links or courses or anything people can access to keep in touch with your work.
So the one thing I would think of sharing is this old idea of the thread. In certain African tribes, they say when someone dies, there's people dying all over the world as we're speaking right now. And they die alone. If it's COVID, they often die alone. And so this old idea was that each person's heart is connected to the stars by a string or a thread. And so when a person dies, it's like a star falls. The death of each person is like a falling star. And so, and the falling of that star makes the world a little darker, and it also is the signal for grieving. And so we're in a time of loss. And if we're gonna gain awareness, we're gonna have to suffer the grieving. But I want to say also about the thread is the old understanding that we are being pulled through life by an invisible thread that is connected, if you go through mythology, to the stars, which is means connected to a destination. And that there are poets who write and say, we're all going to grow old, we're all going to suffer, and people will die. Just don't ever let go of the thread that connects your soul to the soul of the world. And then as far as learning more about what we're doing, it's Mosaic Voices, one word, mosaicvoices.org, or you can Google Michael Meade, and that'll take you there too. And we are in the middle of several series of live events where we address things like the soul of the individual and healing, and the soul of the world and healing.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much for your time with us today and sharing your wisdom. So appreciate your work in the world. Good
being with you, Becca, and learning about all the good things you're doing.
Absolutely. Well, you know, we're all in it together. And yeah, thank you again for your mentorship and your wisdom, and weaving these stories and mythology into our teachings and learnings as we walk this path together. So thank you for your time today. I'm Becca Dakini. Just been speaking with Michael Meade. This is Voices of the Regenerative Decade on One Earth Live.